Now, today we have joining us Professor Park Won-gon of the Handong Global University. It's good to have you on the show with us today.
Thank you for having me here.
Now, I think we should start for our viewers by explaining what this current dispute is and why it has dragged on for so long. So, late last year, Tokyo accused a South Korean warship of locking its missile radar onto a Japanese patrol aircraft, and Tokyo demanded an explanation. Seoul denied it had happened and in fact retorted that it couldn't understand why the plane was flying at such a low altitude in an aggressive flight pattern in the first place, especially as the warship was just carrying out a humanitarian act to save a North Korean boat. So why has it escalated so much over the last month or so?
I think it's rather a very simple issue, and it can be easily found out which side make a mistake. As you said, that our government, the warship, and locked this fire control radar to this Japanese patrol airplane, but our government totally deny of this kind of activity. On the other hand, Japanese government insists that they haven't had the very low altitude flyby to one of the Korean vessels. So this is rather, as I said, simple issue whether this is right or wrong. So actually, the South Korea and Japanese government officials, they met Singapore last year, and they have a working level dialogue to talk about this issue. But if I remember correctly, just one or two rounds of this talk, and then Japanese government totally refused to have another round of talk. So, and then the Japanese government bring this issue on the media, and then the politicians and bureaucrats said that Japan hasn't doing nothing wrong, and all these responsibilities is coming from this Korean government. So, and then we have like a tit for tat. So, very few days ago, the Korean Ministry of National Defense, and he wear the pilot's jacket, and also the Japanese defense minister doing same thing. So we have to stop that. So that's the important point.
Let me break it down a little bit further. I mean, why do Tokyo care? Why is it important for the military that South Korea might have locked on this radar in the first place? What does that really show? What does that mean?
Well, there is several kind of speculation. We don't know the exact intention that Japanese government has. But at this moment, we can think about this. The Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, he's the very important policy. He wanted to make Japan as the normal state because of Japanese so-called peace. The constitution, Japanese government and Japan itself could not have military forces. Rather, they have self-defense forces. So Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, he really wanted to revise this so-called peace constitution and to have military forces. So for that purpose, it is important to raise some kind of tension near the Korean Peninsula. But well, we can easily think about that. We have I think we are facing the North Korea's nuclear threat. But beginning with this last year, we are actually entering the process of this denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, although it's a very slow step. But so for that purpose, in those kind of situations, Japan wanted to raise tension with South Korea.
Some were expecting Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to address this issue directly in his policy speech to open Parliament earlier this week, but he seemed to avoid mentioning South Korea altogether. But he has come out in a media interview and said that he expects the discussions over this issue to be made in a technical manner, as its defense ministry has repeatedly done so. What does he mean by this, and what do you think he's trying to get out of this?
Well, first of all, important thing is that in his foreign policy speech, yes, you are right, he didn't mention about Korea at all. He got the prime ministership back in year 2012 and year 2013. He clearly mentioned in the same speech, the early year speech, that Korea is one of the most important neighboring country for Japan. And after that time, since this year, he mentioned about the South Korea, and South Korea is the important country, and South Korea, Japan should have a more bright future, and those kind of the very positive statement that he had made. But this time, he intentionally omit the South Korea. And then, as you mentioned, right after he made some statement, still But problem is, I haven't heard about this any kind of sign from the Japanese government to resume this working level talk. As I told you, the working level talk is very important. We have several rounds of working level talk, and we can find out who's responsibility of all this kind of incident, and then we can have some guarantee that not repeat this kind of a military incident between these two countries.
Before we move on to those talks, let me try and get a bit more into the mind of Shinzo Abe as well, because there's much interpretation of why the Abe administration is taking such a hardline stance, as you've mentioned a little bit about the military that they want to renovate and renew. But there's also the argument that this issue plays well with his hardline conservatives back in the domestic side, back in Japan. And also because he has in his mind these next two elections that are coming up, one in April, the local elections, and one in July for the upper house elections. Do you think that's a fair interpretation?
Yes, I think so, because especially the July election is very important. In order to revise this constitution, Japan Prime Minister Abe Shinzo at least have a 2/3 of seats in their diet, that's their parliament. So in order to get 2/3 of seats, and he have to raise this kind of tension and to bring this whole the supporters. Starting with this kind of military spat with South Korea, his approval rate is a little bit increased. It's true that, it's a very long history, both actually South Korean politician and also Japanese politician using this kind of a very long-term animosity between these two countries in order to improve their approval rate. So it's a very effective way to gather the support among the supporters. So I pretty much assume that Prime Minister Abe Shinzo is doing exactly the same thing that many politicians have been doing before.
The timing of this dispute comes while some other sensitive South Korea-Japan relation issues are on the forefront as well. Do you think the timing of this radar dispute has gotten bigger because of some of these other issues that are taking place between the two countries right now as well?
Yes, I think so. And we all know that our South Korea's Supreme Court made a final decision to compensate this wartime forced labor by the Japanese companies, but Japanese government totally refused and deny and criticize those decisions. And they are saying that in 1965, when the South Korea and Japan has a basic agreement, and all this responsibility of the Japanese is, reserved by the basic agreement, so they could not accept this kind of decision. That's the very sensitive issue, because Japan is not only forced to bring the Korean labor forces, but all other countries in the East Asia. So if they start to get compensated by Japanese companies, and I don't think they can, compensate all this tremendous number of forced labor during the wartime. So that's one of the very important background that Japanese government has such a strong position against South Korea.
But because of these issues, they antagonize the conservatives back in Japan, and therefore Japan, perhaps, and the Tokyo, as Abe's administration feels they need to take more of this hardline stance. Let's go back to the report we started off with. So South Korean officials have gone to Japan, to the UN-flagged bases, and they're expected to meet with Japanese officials and possibly even meet with US officials to mediate. Do you think these meetings will happen, and do you think it can lead to anything productive?
Well, I think there is a very high possibility to have a so-called trilateral talk among South Korea, Japan, and United States. And you said that, as you mentioned, that the foreign affairs officials, and he's in charge of North American affairs, and he has been invited by United Nations Command, and which is located and actually he is visiting real bases of UNC. So he has a chance to meet his counterpart, Japanese counterpart, and also the Americans. So very good. I think there's a very good opportunity to talk about this issue, especially the military issue about the radar and also the flybys.
Do you think the US wants to get involved in this issue right now, though?
Yes, definitely. But this is a very sensitive issue. You see, South Korea and Japan, we have such a long history of this and the difficulties. So United States, of course, their main purpose is to have a very close cooperation among three countries. That's their very important national interest for a very long period of time. So if there is this kind of difficulties between Japan and South Korea, United States always try to bring these two countries together and to play a mediate role. I remember that in year 2014, and when the President Barack Obama, and he was trying to bring this our president, then President, the Park Geun-hye, and also the Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo together, because I don't know whether you remember that or not, but during this the Park Geun-hye, the administrative government period, also we had a very difficult kind of relationship with Japan, and Park Geun-hye refused to meet Abe Shinzo for 22 months. So after that time, the President Obama is doing kind of a very successful mediate rule. So after that first meeting, and finally we reached agreement in 2015 about the most sensitive issue, this wartime sex slave issue.
But that was President Obama, who was very involved in it. President Trump is very much America first, hands off. So would he want to get involved? I don't see Trump being the mediator as such in this situation.
Yeah, me neither, because President Trump is a very different, unconventional president, and he doesn't have any intention to bring these kind of things. Rather, he probably can take advantage of, it's going too far. But basically, it is United States' interest to have a very close cooperation among these three countries in order to make North Korea denuclearize and also to make a balance against the rising Chinese military power.
So we'll have to see how much the US does get involved in this. But if we go back to what we can do in South Korea, what does the South Korean government, how do they need to play out this thing now? Because as you said, Japan don't really want to seem to engage yet.
But South Korea, our government is more actively trying to engage with Japan. Especially, we have a so-called shuttle diplomacy between our South Korean president and the Japanese prime minister. So it is important to resume this shuttle diplomacy and to talk about the highest level. As I told you, it's not that difficult to resolve this military spat, but more serious problem and sensitive problem issue is the wartime sex slave issue and wartime forced labor issue. It will take time. There is such a huge difference between the two countries. But the important thing is that we have to talk, we have to dialogue. Anyway, Japan and South Korea, we are two the liberal democracy country, and the diplomacy is very important.
Well, we're out of time, so we're going to have to end it there. Thank you for coming into the show today and sharing us your thoughts.
All right, thank you.
And that's where we'll wrap up our show. I'll be back same time tomorrow. And in the meantime, do stay tuned to Arirang for our later newscasts for the latest updates from Korea and around the world. Thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.